She was sold for being barren. Her own mother-in-law traded her away like a used saddle just to settle a debt. In the unforgiving winter of 1883, in the harsh Montana territory, Ilara was cast aside, labeled useless, and stripped of her dignity simply because she hadn't produced an heir for a husband who had already passed. But just when the high society hypocrites expected her to break, the most feared man in the territory, a mountain ghost named Silas Thorne, walked out of the wilderness. He didn't come for gold and he didn't come for furs. He came to make a choice that would shake the entire settlement to its core and prove that a woman's worth is never decided by someone else's ledger. Welcome back to Frontier Rescue Stories. If you love tales of redemption, rugged justice, and romance that blooms against all odds, you have come to the right place. Before we dive into Journey, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button, share this video, and smash subscribe. Your support helps us stir up the algorithm and bring these campfire tales to a larger audience. Also, I love hearing from you. So drop a comment down below and let me know which part of the world you are tuning in from today. The Montana Territory. Winter of 1883. The world was nothing but a canvas of white and gray, where the wind didn't just blow, it hunted. It howled through the timber walls of the Blackwood homestead, a sprawling log fortress that stood as a testament to ambition in a land that hated weakness. But for Ilara Blackwood, this house wasn't a home. It was a mausoleum. Inside, the air was thick with a silence that pressed against the ears. Smoke curled lazily from the chimneys, but the heat never seemed to reach the small, drafty room where Ilara sat. She stared into the embers of a dying hearth, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the pale skin of her knuckles contrasting with the heavy black wool of her dress. She had stitched that dress herself in the hollow, weeks following her husband Liam's death, every needle prick a reminder of the peace she couldn't find. The room was a shrine to a life that had ended too soon. Liam's boot still sat by the door, gathering dust, and his hunting rifle hung on the wall, cold steel that would never again feel the warmth of his grip. He had died on a foolish expedition into the high peaks, chasing fortune, and leaving Ilara with nothing but a surname that felt too heavy to carry. But grief wasn't Ilara's only companion. There was something far sharper living in these halls. The scorn of her mother-in-law, Beatrice Blackwood. Since Liam's passing, Beatrice had looked at Ilara not with shared sorrow, but with the cold calculation of a rancher eyeing a lame horse. The reason was simple, brutal, and spoken in hushed, venomous tones by the servants. Ilara was barren. In the eyes of the frontier, where bloodlines were currency, failing to produce an heir was the ultimate sin. Ilara had borne the insults in silence. She had endured the isolation, the way the farmhands looked through her as if she were a ghost, and the relegation to the coldest wing of the house. She kept her chin high, pinning her hair with dignity, holding on to the lessons her own mother had taught her before the fever took her years ago. But that morning, the fragile peace shattered. Ilara was summoned to Beatrice's study. The matriarch sat behind a heavy oak desk, surrounded by ledgers and contracts. The morning light filtered through the frost on the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, mocking the darkness of the conversation to come. "You leave in 5 days, Ilara," Beatrice said, her voice dry as old parchment. She didn't look up from her papers. Ilara blinked, the air catching in her throat. "Leave to where?" "Mr. Harrow, the trader from the valley, has agreed to take you," Beatrice continued, signing a document with a scratching quill. "He has debts to settle with us, and he is in need of a wife to manage his household. We have agreed that you will serve as compensation." The word hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Compensation. Sold. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. She wasn't being asked to leave. She was being traded like livestock to balance a ledger. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. "You are selling me," Ilara whispered, her voice trembling not with fear but with a sudden molten fury. "I am your son's wife, not a head of cattle." Beatrice finally looked up, her eyes hard as flint. "You made yourself property when you failed to give my son a future," she spat. "Do not blame me for doing what is necessary to protect this family's name. You are a stain on Liam's memory, Ilara, an empty vessel." The silence that followed was louder than a scream. Ilara stood, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wanted to rage, to overturn the desk, to scream that her worth was not defined by her womb. But she had no brothers to defend her, no father to challenge the Blackwood matriarch. She had only her dignity. So she turned and walked out, head held high, though her soul felt mortally wounded. The next few days were a blur of gray fog. Beatrice, in a final act of twisted control, demanded Alara attend the Winter Founders Social at the settlement hall. "One last night to show the town you are leaving with grace?" she had sneered, handing Alara a dress of pearl gray silk. It wasn't a gift, it was a costume for her public execution. The night of the social, the settlement hall glowed like a beacon in the dark valley. Wagons lined up, the breath of horses steaming in the frigid air. Inside, the elite of the territory gathered. Wealthy ranchers, councilmen, and their wives, sipping cider and trading gossip under the warm glow of lanterns. When Alara entered, the room went quiet. The silence rippled outward from the door until the only sound was the crackle of the wood stove and the rustle of stiff fabrics. She walked in alone, wearing a simple black dress instead of the gray silk Beatrice had demanded. It was fitted, impeccable, and adorned only with a small onyx brooch. She refused to wear her mother-in-law's colors. She walked to the center of the room, feeling the gazes of the townspeople like physical blows. "That's her," the whispers hissed. "The barren widow. I heard Beatrice traded her for a wagon of supplies." The humiliation burned her cheeks, but Alara did not falter. She remembered her mother's words. "When the world denies you, you decide who you are." But she wasn't the only one watching. From the top of the staircase, leaning against the railing with the stillness of a predator, stood a man who didn't belong in a ballroom. Silas Thorne. Silas was a legend in the territory, a name spoken with a mix of reverence and fear. He was a mountain man, a tracker who had survived winters that killed lesser men and battles with grizzlies that left maps of scars across his back. He was known for his unshakable integrity. He was a man who had once walked away from a fortune in furs rather than break a promise to a Cheyenne chief. He stood apart from the soft, powdered men of the town, radiating a dangerous, quiet power. He was 38, solitary, and seemingly unreachable. Women of status had tried to tame him, but he remained as distant as the peaks he called home. Until tonight. His piercing blue eyes were fixed on Alara. He watched her walk the gauntlet of judgment, chin up, refusing to break. He saw something the others missed, not a discarded woman, but a warrior standing alone on a battlefield. As the whispers grew louder, Silas moved. He descended the stairs, his worn boots heavy on the wood, his buckskin coat and leather trousers standing in stark contrast to the suits and tails of the other men. The crowd parted instinctively, like water around a stone. Alara felt the shift in the room before she saw him. The air grew tense. She turned, and there he was, towering over her, smelling of pine and wood smoke. "Mrs. Blackwood," Silas rumbled, his voice deep and rough like gravel churning in a riverbed. Alara's heart skipped a beat. "Mr. Thorne," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "I have no place here tonight. I wouldn't want to tarnish your reputation." Silas narrowed his eyes, a flicker of curiosity sparking within them. "The only thing tarnished in this hall, ma'am, is the manners of these people," he said, loud enough for the nearby gossips to hear. He extended a calloused hand. "It makes no sense to have music if we don't start with a proper dance." A gasp went through the room. Beatrice Blackwood, watching from the corner, turned a shade of pale that rivaled the snow outside. Alara looked at the hand, a hand that had skinned wolves and built cabins, a hand that offered safety in a room full of sharks. She took it. As Silas led her to the floor and the musicians stumbled into a waltz, Alara realized that with one simple gesture, the mountain man hadn't just asked for a dance. He had just declared war on the entire social order of the frontier. And as his hand settled firmly but respectfully on her waist, she felt for the first time in forever that she wasn't falling. She was rising. The melody of the frontier waltz was simple, a fiddle and a worn-out guitar, but to the stunned onlookers in the settlement hall, it might as well have been a war drum. Alara moved with the precision of a woman who had once known grace before grief stole it from her. The rough, calloused hand of Silas Thorne held her waist, not with the possessiveness of a buyer, but with the steady firmness of a man guiding a canoe through rapids. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was a fortress that the whispers of the room couldn't breach. When the music faded, the applause was scattered and dry. like leaves skittering across a frozen porch. Silas led her back to the edge of the crowd, ignoring the glares of the councilmen and the open mouths of the ranch wives. He offered a slight, stiff bow, a gesture that looked foreign on a man who spent his life wrestling nature. "Thank you for not fearing the wolf, Mrs. Blackwood," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Before she could answer, he turned and walked out into the snow, leaving a vacuum in the room that was instantly filled with the hiss of scandal. Beatrice Blackwood stood by the punch bowl, her face twisted into a mask of pure, curdled fury. She didn't say a word to Alara. She simply smashed her empty cider cup onto the table and stormed out, signaling that the night, and Alara's brief moment of defiance, was over. By the time the sun dragged itself over the pine-covered ridges the next morning, the story had spread faster than a prairie fire in August. The news wasn't just that they had danced, it was that Silas Thorne, the ghost of the mountains, had publicly laid claim to the barren widow. The trading post, usually a place of haggling over grain and ammunition, was buzzing. Men chewed tobacco and spat into the mud, speculating on why a legend like Thorne would want a woman who had been discarded by her own kin. "Must be witchcraft," some muttered. "Or maybe the mountain man has finally gone mad from the altitude." Back at the homestead, the atmosphere was suffocating. Beatrice paced her study like a caged cougar. When Alara entered to bring the morning tea, a duty she was still forced to perform, Beatrice lashed out. "Do you enjoy dragging our name through the mud?" she hissed, throwing a tin cup into the fireplace. "Mr. Harrow is a respectable trader. Silas Thorne is a savage who lives among bears. And yet, you let him parade you around like a prize mare. I will not allow a woman without a future to stain this family further." Alara set the tray down with a calm she didn't feel. "I did not ask him to dance, Beatrice. But I will not apologize for being treated like a human being for the first time since Liam died." The defiance in her voice only fueled the fire. That afternoon, the vultures arrived. Mrs. Catherine Reed, the surveyor's wife, and the widow Harrison, women who wrapped their insults in silk and polite laughter, came calling. They sat in the parlor, sipping tea, their eyes sharp and assessing. "And how did you manage it, dear?" Mrs. Reed asked, her smile tight. "To catch the eye of such a wild creature? They say Mr. Thorne has never looked twice at a woman. Did you use some sort of charm?" Alara took a slow sip of her tea, tasting the bitterness of the leaves. "Perhaps," she said steadily. "Men like Mr. Thorne simply tire of the show and start looking for substance." The women left with tight smiles and enough gossip to fuel their sewing circles for a month. But amidst the noise, a silent messenger arrived. A young boy from the stables slipped a folded piece of paper into Alara's hand while she was fetching water. It was sealed with plain wax. The note was brief, written in a heavy angular hand, the creek bend behind the pines. "5 them, come alone." It wasn't a request. It was a summons. But for the first time in months, Alara felt a spark of agency. She wrapped herself in her heavy wool shawl and slipped out the back door as the winter sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the snow in shades of violet and bruised blue. The creek bend was a place of stark beauty. The water, black and freezing, cut through the ice, singing its eternal song over the rocks. The scent of pine was sharp in the cold air. Silas was already there, standing with his back to her, watching the horizon. He didn't turn when her boots crunched on the snow. He simply spoke. "I didn't think you'd come." "I didn't think I'd get an invitation," Alara replied, stopping a few paces away. He turned then, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. Up close, he looked even more formidable, a landscape of a man, weathered by wind and time. "This settlement," he began, gesturing vaguely toward the lights in the distance, "is built to chew up anyone who doesn't fit the mold. And yet last night you walked into the lion's den without a weapon." "I had my dignity," she said. "Dignity doesn't stop the wolves, Mrs. Blackwood, but it does make them pause." He stepped closer, his blue eyes searching hers. "I've seen women feign virtue. I've seen them feign weakness to get a husband. You feigned nothing." Alara felt a lump form in her throat. She looked down at the rushing water. She had to be honest. If this man was offering her a lifeline, she couldn't take it under false pretenses. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I am not a candidate for a fairy tale. I have no influential family. I have no dowry. And—" She took a breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. "I cannot guarantee an heir. My mother-in-law sold me because my womb is empty. I am broken goods in the eyes of this territory." She waited for the rejection. She waited for him to nod, tip his hat, and walk away. Instead, Silas nodded slowly. "That is precisely why I chose you." Ilara looked up, perplexed. "I don't understand." "I need a wife, Ilara," he said, using her given name for the first time. The sound of it on his tongue was rough, but not unkind. "I don't need a mother for a child who may never come. I don't need a jewel to wear on my arm at socials. I need a partner." He turned to look at the trees. "I've spent 20 years building a legend. People see the coat, the rifle, and the scars. They tell stories in the saloons. But none of them see the man who goes home to an empty cabin every night. None of them understand what it is to be surrounded by people and yet be completely alone." The weariness in his voice struck a chord in her. It was a loneliness she knew intimately. "I've seen men marry for land," he continued. "I've seen women trade themselves for security. I won't be part of that dance. If I marry, it will be to someone who understands that marriage isn't a romance novel. It's a partnership, equals, bound by respect, not illusions." He looked back at her, his gaze intense. "I propose an agreement. You will have my name, my protection. The town will not dare touch Mrs. Silas Thorne. In return, I ask for loyalty, discretion, and a home that isn't cold when I return from the hunt. I am not a man of soft words or tenderness, but I will never mistreat you." The wind howled through the pines, but Ilara felt a strange warmth spreading in her chest. It wasn't love. It was far too early for that. It was relief. He wasn't asking her to be a broodmare. He was asking her to be a witness to his life, just as he would be to hers. She took a step toward the creek, her mind racing. A marriage of duty, a cold pact, but it was better than being sold like cattle to a stranger. It was a choice, her choice. "I accept," she said finally, "but with one condition." Silas tilted his head. "I'm listening." "You must never take from me who I am," she said firmly. "Do not ask me to be mute. Do not ask me to be invisible or to hide behind your shadow. If I am to be your partner, I will have a voice." Silas looked at her, a flicker of something like admiration crossing his stoic features. "Never," he vowed. "I wouldn't have it any other way." He didn't reach out to touch her. He simply nodded, a sharp, decisive motion that sealed their fate. There were no kisses, no rings, and no promises of eternal love. Just two broken people standing in the snow, agreeing to survive the winter together. As Ilara walked back toward the homestead, leaving the mountain man by the water, she knew the hardest part was yet to come. The town would riot. Beatrice would scream. But for the first time since Liam died, Ilara wasn't afraid of the storm. She was walking straight into it. The days following the pact at the creek moved with the grinding slowness of a wagon, wheel stuck in deep mud. The settlement was in an uproar. The idea that the barren widow had secured the hand of Silas Thorne wasn't just a scandal. It was seen as a theft. The marriage contract was drawn up not in a church, but in the sterile office of the territorial council. The air smelled of stale tobacco and old paper. Beatrice Blackwood sat in the corner, her face a mask of granite, refusing to look at Ilara, the lawyer. A man with ink-stained fingers and shifting eyes read the clauses aloud. There were no mentions of love or devotion. It was a list of property rights, dowry waivers, and conduct expectations. When the lawyer reached a clause stating, Ilara was to restrict her movements to the homestead and refrain from public gatherings to preserve the dignity of the name, Ilara stiffened. She stood by the window, watching the gray sky, and spoke clearly. "I will not be locked in a cage, sir, even one made of gold." Before the lawyer could argue, Silas stepped forward from the shadows of the doorway. He took the quill from the desk, scratching a thick line of black ink through the paragraph. "Respect and freedom," he growled, his voice leaving no room for debate. "That was the agreement, and that is what I will honor." The wedding itself was less a celebration and more a solemn formality. It took place on a Tuesday morning, when the fog was so thick you could hardly see the church steeple. There were no arches of flowers, no musicians playing joyous reels. The church was cold, the stove in the back fighting a losing battle against the Montana winter. The pews were largely empty. A few councilmen sat in the back out of curiosity, and Beatrice refused to attend at all. Alara arrived alone in a dark wagon. She wore no silk or lace. Her dress was cream wool, simple and modest, stitched by the nuns at the St. Michael's Mission, women who knew her heart better than her own family did. There were no jewels on her neck, only a small wooden cross on a leather cord, a gift from an orphan boy who had pressed it into her hand the day before, whispering, "So you won't be alone, Miss Alara." She walked down the aisle with her head high. Silas waited at the altar, dressed in his finest buckskin suit, clean but rugged. He looked like a pine tree trapped in a parlor. When the parson asked for the vows, they spoke them with clear, steady voices, but there was no tremor of emotion. When pronounced man and wife, Silas did not kiss her. He merely took her hand, his fingers cold as the stone floor, and led her out into the gray light. The ride to Silas's homestead was silent. The house was different from the Blackwood estate. It was smaller, built of rough-hewn logs, but sturdy. However, the welcome was cold. Silas led her to the north wing, a set of rooms far from his own quarters. "This is your domain," he said simply, before retreating to his own silence. That night, as Alara sat before her vanity, removing the pins from her hair, a servant slid a note under her door. It was sealed with plain wax. Inside, in Silas's angular handwriting, were words that cut deep. "I owe you no affection, but I promise not to dishonor you." Alara stared at the paper. She hadn't expected love, but the confirmation of the emptiness between them settled in her chest like a stone. She didn't cry. She simply blew out the candle and lay in the dark, understanding that her battle against loneliness was far from over. In the weeks that followed, the town continued to sharpen its knives. Mrs. Reed and the other socialites whispered that Alara was merely a housekeeper with a ring, a woman tolerated but not wanted. To escape the suffocating atmosphere of the homestead and the judgment of the town, Alara turned to the only place that had ever welcomed her without conditions, St. Michael's Mission. It was a humble structure on the edge of the settlement, with a leaking roof and oiled paper for windows. But inside, it was warm with humanity. Alara went there daily, dressed in plain clothes, scrubbing floors, mending sheets, and reading letters to illiterate trappers. She wasn't Mrs. Thorne here. She was just Alara. She tended to Mary, a miner's widow struggling to feed 3 children. She sat with old Thomas, a woodcarver crippled by a bear attack, listening to his stories of the old frontier. She held the hands of the dying when the doctor was too busy with paying customers. Slowly, the name, the barren widow, began to fade among the common folk, replaced by whispers of the lady with the gentle hands. Silas, true to his nature, said nothing about her absences. But he was a tracker. He noticed everything. One afternoon, the sky threatening snow, Silas rode down to the mission. He didn't announce himself. He tied his horse to the rail and stepped quietly into the doorway. Inside, the air smelled of sickness and lye soap. He saw Alara sitting by a cot, reading from a tattered Bible to a blind woman named Clara. Alara looked tired, strands of hair escaping her bun, her hands red from work, but her face was illuminated by a soft, genuine smile he had never seen at the homestead. He watched her pour water for a coughing child, her touch tender and assured. He saw the way the people looked at her, not with the scorn of the high society wives, but with reverence. She wasn't the broken, useless woman Beatrice Blackwood had sold. She was a pillar of strength holding up the roof of this forgotten place. For a long time, the mountain man stood in the shadows, his chest tightening with a feeling he couldn't quite name. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. He saw a solitude that matched his own, but unlike him, she had turned her loneliness into love for others. He left before she saw him, slipping away like a ghost. But that evening, when Alara returned to the homestead, the fire in her room had already been lit, and a fresh stack of firewood sat neatly by the hearth. A silent, anonymous offering from a man who was beginning to see his wife for the first time. The firewood left in her room was the first spark, but the true fire was about to be lit. A week later, the Territorial Charity Foundation held its annual gala. It was an event of stiff collars and stiffer drinks, where the wealthy patted themselves on the back for throwing crumbs to the poor. Silas was required to attend, and for the first time, Ilara's name was on the invitation list. The town expected her to cower. They expected the barren widow to hide in Silas's shadow, grateful for the scraps of social standing. Instead, Ilara walked into the hall wearing a dress of dark wine wool, embroidered with black thread, simple, but the color of a heart that beats strong and deep. She held her head high, her hand resting lightly on Silas's arm. When the speeches began, the councilman droned on about statistics, grain yields, and budget allocations. But when the moderator announced that Mrs. Thorne would speak on behalf of the mission, a hush fell over the room, a silence thick with anticipation and mockery. Ilara ascended the wooden platform. She didn't have a prepared speech. She gripped the podium, looking out at the sea of faces that had judged her. "I bring no figures or promises of profit," she began, her voice clear as water running over stone. "I bring names. Rose, who lost her husband on the trail and sleeps on a floor. Thomas, who cannot walk but carves birds for children so they remember beauty exists. Clara, who sings hymns though she can no longer see the sun." She paused, her eyes locking with Mrs. Reed in the front row. "They wait not for your charity, but for your eyes. They wait to be seen as equals, not as burdens." She stepped back. For a moment there was no sound, no polite clapping, just the stunned silence of a room that had been stripped of its pretenses. Then a single sharp clap echoed from the center of the hall. It was Silas. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at her. His applause was slow, deliberate, and firm like a hammer striking iron. Slowly the common folk in the back joined in, then the merchants, until the room filled with a sound that wasn't for the council, but for the woman who spoke the truth. The following morning, the spring thaw began to drip from the eaves of the mission. Ilara was tending to a patient when a shadow fell across the floor. Silas stood there, not in his gala suit, but in his trail clothes. He walked to her, ignoring the stares of the patients, and stopped by a bookshelf. "I can't ignore the whispers anymore, Ilara," he said quietly. "Everyone in this territory thinks they know who you are. They have their stories. But I know nothing." Ilara leaned against the shelf, feeling the weight of the secret she had carried for so long. "And now you want to know?" Silas nodded. "I want the truth." Ilara looked out the window, her hands trembling. "I am not sterile, Silas," she whispered. "Or at least, I wasn't." Silas frowned, confusion clouding his sharp eyes. "What happened?" "I conceived during my first year with Liam," she confessed, the words tearing at old wounds. "I wrote to Beatrice. I thought she would finally accept me. Instead, she told me not to get my hopes up. She worked me harder. She demanded I organize the harvest festival, stand for hours, and lift heavy crates. When I told her I was bleeding, she called me weak. She said a true Blackwood doesn't ruin her duty over a little discomfort." Tears pricked her eyes, hot and fast. "I lost the child one dawn, alone in my room. No doctor. Just pain and blood soaking the sheets. Beatrice told me to clean it up and never speak of it. She said I had failed." The silence that followed was heavy. Ilara waited for the pity or the disgust. Instead, Silas took a step closer. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before gently touching her arm. A touch so light it burned. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Because the world had already decided I was empty," she replied. "And you said you needed a wife without complications." Silas moved his hand to cup her cheek, calluses against soft skin. "I don't desire children from you, Ilara," he said, his blue eyes fierce. "I desire to understand you." It was a vow stronger than the one they had made in the church. That night, the atmosphere in the territory shifted. It was the founding anniversary, the biggest night of the year. Silas sent a note to the council and one to the Blackwood estate. "My wife deserves honor. If you cannot give it, do not speak her name." When the doors to the settlement hall opened at 9 o'clock, the room went still. "Mr. Silas Thorne and his wife, Mrs. Ilara Thorne," the announcer called out. Ilara stepped in. She wore a dress of deep burgundy wool with simple bone buttons, a color that commanded respect without asking for it. Her hair was pinned back to reveal a simple silver locket, but it was the way she walked that stopped breath in the room. She was no longer a shadow. She was a presence. Silas walked beside her, his back straight, his eyes scanning the room like a wolf guarding its mate. He led her to the absolute center of hall, under the great chandelier. Beatrice Blackwood watched from a darkened balcony, her face pale as a sheet. Silas stopped. He didn't speak to Councilman. He turned to Alara, took her gloved hand in his, and raised it. In front of the entire settlement, the gossips, traitors, hypocrites, he bowed his head and kissed her hand. It wasn't a romantic flutter. It was a seal of authority. It was a declaration that this woman stood under his protection, and more importantly, in his high esteem. He offered her his arm again, and as they walked through the crowd, the people didn't just stare. They bowed their heads. Not to Silas, but to Alara. Beatrice turned away on the balcony, unable to watch her power evaporate, and slipped out the back door, defeated by a woman who refused to break. Alara squeezed Silas's arm, and for the first time he squeezed back. The winter was ending. The ice was breaking. And in the center of the hall, amidst the music and the light, a new legend was being written, not of a mountain man, but of the wife who had tamed his solitude. The snow melted, and with it, the cold walls that Silas Thorne had built around his heart finally gave way. The night after the gala, the homestead didn't feel like a fortress anymore. It felt like a home waiting to be lived in. Silas found Alara sitting by the window, embroidering by the light of a kerosene lamp. The silence between them wasn't heavy with unspoken contracts anymore. It was comfortable, like a worn leather saddle. He watched her for a long moment, then did something that shook the floorboards of his own pride. The mountain man, who bowed to no one, walked across the room and knelt before her. Alara dropped her needle, her eyes wide. "Silas?" "I don't want to live in a marriage by duty anymore," he murmured, his voice rough with honesty. "Not after all we've shared. You don't deserve a husband by halves, Alara. I don't want you to be my wife by convenience. I want you to be my wife by love." The words hung in the air, heavier and more precious than any gold nugget found in the creek. Silas had spent 38 years convincing himself that solitude was strength, but Alara had shown him that true strength wasn't in standing alone. It was in letting someone else stand with you. Alara reached out, taking his weathered face in her hands. Tears shimmered in her eyes. Not tears of grief this time, but of release. "Don't kneel before me, Silas," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "If you love me, walk at my side. Not before me, not behind me. At my side. I want your partnership, not your worship." He stood, pulling her into his arms, and there, in the quiet of the north wing, they sealed a new pact. No lawyers, no contracts, just two souls choosing each other. 9 years passed. The Wyoming Territory changed, but nowhere changed as much as the Thorne homestead. The gardens, once barren rock and ice, were now a riot of wildflowers and climbing roses that Alara had coaxed from the earth. But the greatest miracle wasn't the flowers. Under the shade of the central arbor, a boy of 9 named Liam, named in forgiveness for the past, was learning to whittle wood with a knife his father had given him. He had Silas's piercing blue eyes and his mother's gentle spirit. Chasing butterflies near the creek was 6-year-old Elizabeth, a whirlwind of laughter and energy. The barren widow had brought 2 lives into the world. The doctors called it a miracle. Silas called it destiny. The births had been hard, terrifying battles, but Alara had fought for them with the same ferocity she had fought for her dignity. One bright spring morning, a messenger arrived from the settlement. He carried a decree sealed with the territorial stamp. The council, the same body that had once scorned her, had voted unanimously. Silas read the decree aloud to a gathered crowd in the town square. For her dedication to the common people, her example of dignity, and her service to the forgotten, the territory grants Mrs. Alara Thorne the title of Keeper of the People's Heart. The applause that followed was thunderous. It wasn't just the wealthy ranchers clapping. It was the miners, the orphans, the widows, and the trappers. Alara stood on the platform, gray streaking her hair, her hands marked by work, and smiled. She had won the war without ever firing a shot. And what of Beatrice Blackwood? History is often cruel to those who choose pride over love. She died alone in a distant mountain cabin, refusing to speak Alara's name to the end. But weeks later, Alara received a worn journal found among the old woman's effects. On the last page, written in a shaky hand, were the words, "Perhaps I was wrong. Not for her being sterile, but for her being stronger than I ever was." Alara read the words by the fire, then tossed the book into the flames. She didn't need the validation of a ghost. She had the love of a mountain man, the laughter of her children, and the respect of an entire territory. That night, as the bells of the settlement rang out across the valley, not for a wedding or a victory, but simply to celebrate the spring, Silas and Alara sat on the porch swing. He rested his head on her shoulder, his hand holding hers, calluses against softness. They listened to the bells, knowing that love, when born amidst scorn and cold, burns the brightest. And that, my friends, is the legend of Alara and Silas. A reminder that sometimes being rejected by the world is the only way to find where you truly belong. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Make sure you are subscribed and have that notification bell turned on so you never miss a trip back to the frontier. What did you think of Beatrice's final confession in the diary? Was it enough to redeem her, or was it too little, too late? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this, check out the playlist on your screen right now for more stories of rugged justice and romance in the Old West. I'm Jasper, this is Frontier Rescue Stories, and until next time, keep your powder dry and your heart open. Happy trails.